whispers in the walls. The human mind is remarkable at finding patterns in random noise. We see faces in clouds, hear words in white noise, and find meaning in coincidence. That's what I kept telling myself during those first few nights in my great Aunt Clara's Victorian house. But I know now that some patterns aren't just tricks of the mind. Sometimes the whispers in the walls are real, and sometimes they're trying to tell us something we were never meant to know. I inherited the house 3 months ago, after Clara's death at 94. I'd only met her twice, once at a family reunion when I was 12, and again at my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. Both times, she struck me as someone who carried secrets. There was a heaviness to her gaze, a careful measure to her words that suggested she was always holding something back. When her lawyer called to tell me she'd left me her house, I was shocked. I'd expected it to go to someone closer to her, someone who knew her better. The lawyer seemed equally puzzled and mentioned that Clara had changed her will just 2 months before her death. She was very specific, he said, shuffling papers on his end of the phone. The house goes to Sarah Mitchell. That's you, and only you. She left a letter explaining that it had to be you, though I'm afraid that letter is sealed and meant for your eyes only. That should have been my first warning sign. But at 28, drowning in rent payments for a cramped city apartment and struggling to make ends meet as a freelance journalist, the prospect of owning a house, even a potentially high-maintenance Victorian, was too tempting to ignore. Besides, I'd always been drawn to old houses and their histories, the stories they could tell if only walls could speak. Be careful what you wish for. The house stood at the end of Maple Grove Road, set back from the street behind a curtain of ancient oak trees. It was exactly what you'd expect from a Victorian mansion. 3 stories of faded grandeur, with a wraparound porch, intricate gingerbread trim, and a widow's walk that seemed to peer out over the small town of Millbrook like a sentinel. The paint, once probably a cheerful yellow, had weathered to the color of old bones. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late September, my small U-Haul containing everything I owned, looking almost comically inadequate next to the massive house. The key was old brass, heavy and cold in my palm as I approached the front door. It turned with a reluctance that made me wonder if the house itself was resistant to my presence. Inside, the air was thick with the peculiar stillness of places long undisturbed. Dust motes danced in the shafts of autumn sunlight that pierced the windows, and my footsteps echoed on hardwood floors that hadn't felt human weight in months. The furniture was all covered in white sheets, giving the impression of a room full of ghosts, frozen in various poses of daily life. I spent that first afternoon uncovering furniture, opening windows to let in fresh air, and trying to make at least the ground floor feel somewhat livable. Great Aunt Clara had apparently been a collector of antiques, and every room was filled with pieces that probably belonged in a museum. Heavy Victorian sofas, ornate side tables, oil paintings in gilded frames. It was like stepping back in time. It wasn't until sunset that I heard it for the first time. I was in what I designated as my bedroom, a second-floor room with bay windows overlooking the front yard, unpacking clothes into a massive mahogany wardrobe. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and blood red. As I hung up a dress, I heard what sounded like someone exhaling softly, followed by words too quiet to make out. I froze, hanger still in hand. The sound had come from inside the wall to my left. "Hello?" I called out, feeling immediately foolish. Of course, no one was there. It was just the house settling, or maybe the wind finding its way through old pipes. Every old house had its quirks, its own vocabulary of creaks and groans. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Not words exactly, but the cadence of speech. Like hearing a conversation through a thick wall where you can make out the rise and fall of voices, but not the specific words. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper, its faded floral pattern cool against my skin. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, must remember. The words were so clear, so distinctly formed that I jerked back from the wall. My heart was suddenly hammering in my chest. Those 2 words hadn't come from pipes or settling foundations. They hadn't been a trick of the wind or my imagination. They had been spoken as clearly as if someone stood on the other side of the wall. But that was impossible. I'd seen the house's layout. There was nothing on the other side of that wall except the space between the interior and exterior walls. I backed away, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. I was tired from moving, my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe there was a radio playing in a neighboring house, the sound carrying strangely through the old walls. There had to be a logical explanation. That's when I noticed the letter on my bed. I hadn't put it there. I was certain of that. All my belongings were still in boxes, and I hadn't unpacked any papers yet. But there it sat on the pristine white bedspread, a yellowed envelope, the paper brittle with age. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. My name was written on the front in spidery handwriting I didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell. The seal was unbroken, the wax a deep burgundy color that looked almost black in the fading light. As I turned the envelope over, the whispers started again. This time, they came from all around me, a chorus of urgent murmurs that seemed to fill the entire room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. They wanted me to open the letter. With shaking hands, I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same spidery handwriting as the envelope. At the top was a date, September 15th, 1952. Before I could read further, every light in the house went out at once, plunging me into total darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, a single whisper, crystal clear and right beside my ear, spoke 5 words that made my blood run cold. "Now you can finally hear us." In that first moment of darkness, I couldn't move. My fingers still gripped the letter, the paper's edge sharp against my trembling hands. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive somehow, expectant, as if the very air was waiting for me to do something. My phone was in my back pocket. I pulled it out, fingers fumbling as I turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the room. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The sheet-covered furniture no longer looked like mere covered antiques. Now they seemed like crouching figures, waiting. I forced myself to look down at the letter in my hands. The beam from my phone illuminated the yellowed paper, making the spidery handwriting dance as my hands shook. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then they've chosen you, just as they chose me 70 years ago. The whispers have already started, haven't they? They always begin at sunset. They'll seem confusing at first, fragments of conversations from long ago, but they're trying to tell you something. Something I was too afraid to face. There are things in this house that need to be remembered, truths that have been buried for too long. I tried to silence them, to wall them up with plaster and paint and denial, but they wouldn't stay quiet. They never stay quiet. You'll find my diary in the library, behind the copy of Great Expectations on the 3rd shelf. Read it, understand what happened here. And Sarah, be careful who you trust. Not everyone in Millbrook wants these secrets revealed. The burden is yours now. I'm sorry. Clara." The letter slipped from my fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. As if responding to its movement, the whispers started again, more urgent this time. They seemed to be coming from the direction of what I assumed was the library. I should have left. Any rational person would have packed their car and driven away, leaving this house with its whispers and secrets behind. But Clara's letter had awakened something in me, a curiosity that went beyond mere intrigue. I had to know what these voices were trying to tell me. Using my phone's light to guide me, I made my way downstairs to the library. The room was smaller than I'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 3 walls. The air smelled of old leather and paper, with an undertone of something else, something metallic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The whispers grew louder as I approached the shelves. It took me several minutes to find Great Expectations. The books weren't arranged in any obvious order. When I finally pulled it from the shelf, I heard a distinct click and felt something shift behind the books. Reaching into the space where the book had been, my fingers touched leather. I pulled out a small, cloth-bound diary, its pages yellow with age. A ribbon bookmark protruded from somewhere in the middle, marking a page that seemed more worn than the others. Before I could open it, a loud crash came from upstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The whispers suddenly stopped, replaced by an absolute silence that felt even more threatening. Then, clear as day, a woman's voice called out, "Sarah, don't let them find it." I spun around, the diary clutched to my chest. The library door, which I'd left open, slowly began to close on its own. Just before it shut completely, I caught a glimpse of something in the hallway. A figure, dark and indistinct, moving up the stairs. The lights flickered back on, humming to life as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I looked down at the diary in my hands, my thumb brushing against its worn cover. A piece of paper slipped out, a newspaper clipping from 1952. The headline made my heart stop. Local woman vanishes from boarding house. Margaret Mitchell last seen at Clara Mitchell's residence. Margaret Mitchell, my grandmother's sister. The aunt I'd been told had run away to start a new life in California. The aunt whose real fate I was beginning to suspect was far more sinister. The whispers returned, but this time they formed words I could clearly understand. "Find the others, Sarah. Find us all." As if in response, I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate steps moving across the ceiling. They weren't the creaks of an old house settling. They were too purposeful, too measured, and they were heading toward the stairs. I opened the diary with trembling hands, turning to the ribbon-marked page. Clara's handwriting here was different from the letter. More frantic, the words pressed deep into the paper as if written in a state of panic. October 1st, 1952. They know. God help me. They know what I did. Margaret wasn't the first, and if they find out about the others, I can hear them in the walls now, their whispers growing louder every night. I have to find a way to silence them. The new wallpaper isn't enough. They're getting through. Maybe if I seal off the room entirely. Yes, that's what I'll do. Wall it up completely. No one will ever know. The sounds will stop. They have to stop. But the blood, how do I explain all the blood? The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs. They paused there, as if whoever, or whatever, was making them was deciding which way to go. I held my breath, the diary trembling in my hands. Then, slowly, deliberately, they began descending toward the library. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I shoved the diary into my jacket pocket and looked frantically around the library for another exit. There was a window behind the heavy oak desk, but it was too small to climb through. The footsteps were halfway down the stairs now, each deliberate step making the old wood groan in protest. That's when I noticed the bookshelf to my right looked slightly different from the others. The edge protruded about an inch further than its neighbors, and there was a faint draft coming from behind it. In any other situation, I might have dismissed these details, but Clara's diary had mentioned sealing off rooms. Maybe. I ran my fingers along the shelf's edge, heart pounding in time with the approaching footsteps. There, a small depression in the wooden trim. I pressed it and something clicked inside the wall. The entire bookshelf swung inward with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow passage. Without hesitation, I slipped inside, pulling the shelf closed behind me, just as the footsteps reached the library door. Through the small gap between the shelf and the wall, I watched as the door slowly opened. The figure that entered wasn't what I expected. It was a man, probably in his 70s, wearing an old-fashioned suit that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. He moved with purpose, scanning the room with pale, almost colorless eyes. Something about him seemed wrong. His edges weren't quite solid, and I could see the faintest suggestion of the wallpaper through his form. "I know you're here, Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the crisp pronunciation of someone from another era. "The diary doesn't belong to you. Some secrets should stay buried." I pressed myself further into the passage, trying to control my breathing. The air here was stale and thick with the same metallic smell I'd noticed in the library, only stronger, much stronger. The man moved to the desk, running his hand along its surface. "Your aunt understood the importance of discretion. She protected our little town's secrets for decades. Such a shame she chose to burden you with them in the end." A whisper brushed past my ear, urgent and familiar. "Run, Sarah, now!" I turned and fled down the passage, using my phone's light to guide me. The corridor was narrow, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. Decades of dust covered the floor, but I could see footprints in it. Old ones, small and hurried. as if someone had run this way long ago. The passage turned sharply left, then right, heading deeper into the house. The metallic smell grew stronger, and I realized with growing horror what it reminded me of. Blood. Old blood. Behind me, I heard the bookshelf open. "Ah!" the man's voice echoed down the passage. "So predictable, just like your Aunt Margaret." I ran faster, my phone's beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The passage ended at what looked like a dead end, but there was a door handle protruding from the wall. I grabbed it, turned it, and practically fell into the room beyond. It was a bedroom, but not one that had seen use in decades. Everything was perfectly preserved, frozen in time like a museum display. A bed with floral sheets, a vanity with an array of old perfume bottles, clothes still hanging in the open closet. On the vanity mirror, written in what looked horrifyingly like dried blood, were the words, "Find the others." A newspaper clipping was pinned to the wall, dated October 15, 1952. 3 more women missing, police baffled by disappearances. Below it was a photograph showing a group of young women standing in front of the house. I recognized my Aunt Margaret among them, smiling at the camera. She was wearing the same dress that now hung in the closet, perfectly preserved. The footsteps were getting closer. I had to move, but something caught my eye on the vanity. A leather-bound book, similar to Clara's diary but newer. I grabbed it and noticed a name embossed on the cover, Margaret Mitchell's journal. The whispers started again, this time a chorus of women's voices, all speaking at once. "The basement, Sarah. You'll find us in the basement." The footsteps were almost at the door. I looked around desperately for another exit and spotted a narrow door partially hidden behind a dresser. It opened to reveal a servant's staircase, leading both up and down. "You can't run forever, Miss Mitchell," the man called out, his voice closer now. "This house has many secrets, but they all end the same way." I took the stairs down, moving as quietly as I could. The whispers followed me, guiding me, left at the bottom, behind the coal chute. "Hurry." As I descended, I opened Margaret's journal to a random page. The entry was dated October 1st, 1952. He's done this before. Clara knows. She has to know. The other girls figured it out too late. The boarding house was never about giving young women a fresh start in town. It was about making them disappear. I found proof in the basement, behind the old coal chute. God help me. I've found them all. I have to get word to the police, but he's watching the house. Clara says she'll help me, says she'll keep me safe, but something's wrong. The way she looks at me now, I don't think I can trust my own sister anymore. The whispers suddenly became more urgent. "He's coming. Run." I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned left, running past rows of preserved jars and old furniture. The coal chute was there, a black square in the wall, and beside it, a door. A door that had been wallpapered over to match the basement walls, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. The man's footsteps echoed on the servant's stairs, unhurried now. He knew he had me cornered. With trembling hands, I reached for the hidden door's edge, praying it would open. As my fingers touched the wallpaper, all the whispers spoke as one. "Now you'll see what they did to us." The wallpaper peeled away with a sound like tearing skin, revealing a heavy wooden door underneath. The footsteps above had reached the bottom of the servant's stairs. I could hear them moving methodically through the basement now, checking each corner, each shadow. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the door handle. It turned with a resistance that spoke of decades of disuse, the mechanism inside grinding against itself. When it finally opened, the hinges released a low moan that seemed to echo through the entire basement. "The past has a way of staying buried, Miss Mitchell," the man's voice called out, closer now. "Your aunt understood that, eventually." I slipped through the door and closed it behind me, finding myself in complete darkness. My phone's flashlight revealed a narrow room, longer than it was wide, with walls of bare earth and stone. The air was thick with the metallic smell I'd noticed before, so strong now it made my gorge rise. In the beam of light revealed what looked like old steamer trunks lining one wall. 5 of them, their leather cracked and peeling with age. Each had a name written on a tag. Margaret Mitchell, Jane Cooper, Alice Thompson, Ruth Gardner, Mary Sullivan. "Oh God," I whispered, the horror of what I was seeing finally hitting me. They never left. None of them left. The whispers returned, surrounding me. Now you know, now you can tell our story. I heard something scrape against the door. He was there on the other side. I backed away, bumping into the far wall. My light beam caught something pale protruding from the earth there. I stepped closer, then immediately wished I hadn't. A hand, skeletal but with bits of preserved flesh still clinging to it, reached out from the packed soil. The door handle began to turn. I frantically searched for another way out. The room was a dead end, but there, near the ceiling, a narrow window well, probably once used to deliver coal. It was small, barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was my only chance. The door opened just as I managed to reach the window. I pulled myself up, hearing the man's footsteps enter the room behind me. The window well was filled with decades of dirt and debris, but desperation gave me strength. I clawed my way through, emerging into the cold night air just as a hand grabbed at my ankle. I kicked free and scrambled away from the window, finding myself in the overgrown side yard of the house. The moon had risen, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. My phone was gone, lost in the frantic climb through the window, but I still had both diaries clutched against my chest. Not stopping to catch my breath, I ran toward the front of the house. I had to get to my car, had to get help. But as I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing on the front porch was Clara. Not the elderly aunt I'd met at my grandmother's funeral, but Clara as she must have looked in 1952. Young, beautiful, and terrifyingly solid, despite being clearly transparent in the moonlight. She wore a dress from that era, and her face held an expression of profound sadness. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I tried to protect them at first, but Theodore, he was so persuasive, said it was for the good of the town. Some of the girls, he said, were asking too many questions, getting too close to certain secrets. And Margaret, oh Margaret, she was going to expose everything." The man, Theodore, emerged from around the other side of the house, walking with the same unhurried confidence. Unlike Clara, there was no sadness in his expression, only cold determination. "Your aunt made a choice, Miss Mitchell," he said. "The same choice you'll have to make now. Some secrets protect more than just individuals. They protect an entire community. Surely you understand that?" I backed away from both of them, clutching the diaries tighter. "They were innocent women," I said, my voice shaking. "They had families, lives. They were threats," Theodore countered, moving closer. "To the stability of this town, to certain arrangements that kept Millbrook prosperous. Your Aunt Margaret discovered something she shouldn't have, something bigger than just missing girls, and now you're following the same path." The whispers started again, but this time they weren't just in the walls. They rose from the ground itself, from the very earth of the property. The voices of 5 women, no longer muffled or confused, spoke with perfect clarity. "Show them, Sarah. Show them what we found." With trembling fingers, I opened Margaret's journal to the last entry, dated October 3rd, 1952. As I read it aloud, my voice grew stronger, carrying through the night air. "I finally understand why they had to silence us. The ledgers in Theodore's office, the shipping manifests, the photographs. This town wasn't built on textile money like everyone believes. It was built on something much darker. Human trafficking, decades of it. And it's still happening. The boarding house isn't just for making troublesome women disappear. It's part of their operation. Clara knows. She's been helping them keep it quiet. But I have proof now. Real proof. God forgive me, but I have to try to get this information to the police. If you're reading this, I probably failed, but maybe you can succeed where I couldn't." I looked up from the journal to find more figures had appeared. Transparent shapes in the moonlight, dozens of them, all women of different eras. They stood in a circle around Theodore and Clara, their whispers growing to a crescendo. "Your aunt chose silence," Theodore said, his form flickering like a bad television signal. "Chose to protect the town. Chose to help us continue our work. And now, Miss Mitchell, it's time for you to make the same choice." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something that gleamed in the moonlight. A gun, old but well-maintained. The same gun, I realized with growing horror, that must have been used on Margaret and the others. But I wasn't alone anymore. The whispers had become a roar, and the spirits of the women moved closer, their forms growing more solid with each step. Clara backed away, her ghostly face twisted with guilt and fear. "No more silence," the voices said as one. "No more secrets." And then they surged forward, a tide of ethereal vengeance decades in the making. What happened next exists in my memory like a series of photographs, moments frozen in the silver light of that October moon. The spirits of murdered women, decades of victims, converging on Theodore like a tide of righteous fury, his ghost flickering like static, the ancient gun passing harmlessly through now incorporeal fingers. Clara's scream as the spirits surrounded her too, forcing her to witness every murder, every moment of betrayal she'd helped conceal. I stood rooted to the spot, clutching the diaries as the supernatural vengeance unfolded before me. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the voices of the dead, no longer whispers but full-throated accusations. Names, dates, locations, every detail of decades of trafficking and murder poured out into the night air. Theodore's spirit tried to flee, but the vengeful dead had waited too long for this moment. They held him in place, forcing him to face each of his victims. I saw his ghostly form twist and distort as the weight of his crimes literally crushed him. Clara fell to her knees, her spirit becoming more transparent with each revelation. "I'm sorry," she kept saying over and over. "I was afraid. He said he'd kill my family if I didn't help. I was so afraid." But the spirits were beyond forgiveness. As I watched, both Theodore and Clara's ghosts began to fade, not into nothingness but into something worse. An eternal moment of confronting their guilt, trapped forever with the truth of what they'd done. Just before they vanished completely, Margaret's spirit stepped forward from the crowd. Unlike the others, she approached me, her form the clearest I'd seen yet. She looked just like the photo I'd seen, young and determined. But now her eyes held decades of waiting. "In my journal," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years, "there's a key taped to the last page. It opens a safety deposit box at Millbrook First National, box 1952. Everything is there. Proof of what they did, what they're still doing, names, dates, photographs. The operation didn't die with Theodore. The sons of Millbrook's finest families carried on their father's work. It's still happening, Sarah. That's why Clara chose you. She knew you were a journalist, knew you'd keep digging until you found the truth." I looked down at the journal in my hands, then back at my aunt's spirit. Why didn't she just go to the police herself? "Guilt can be a prison," Margaret said softly. "She couldn't bring herself to act while she lived, so she found another way. She knew the spirits of this house would choose someone who could finish what I started." The other spirits had begun to fade, their vengeance satisfied, but Margaret remained. "The current operation uses abandoned properties on the edge of town, Harper's old mill, the closed paper factory on River Road. Save them, Sarah. Save the ones they're holding now." She started to fade too, but before she disappeared completely, she smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "Thank you for hearing us, for making them remember." And then I was alone in the moonlight, holding 2 diaries and decades of buried truth. What happened next is a matter of public record. The evidence in Margaret's safety deposit box was enough to launch a federal investigation. Combined with Clara's diary and the bodies found in the basement, it brought down a trafficking ring that had operated for over 70 years. Dozens of Millbrook's most prominent families were implicated. More importantly, 17 women were rescued from the modern operation. The house still stands at the end of Maple Grove Road. I live here now, though most people think I'm crazy for staying. The whispers haven't stopped entirely, but they're different now. Peaceful, almost protective. Sometimes on quiet nights, I hear them sharing their stories, making sure they're not forgotten. I've turned the house into a shelter for trafficking survivors. The rooms that once held darkness now offer safety and healing. The walls that once concealed horrible secrets now protect women rebuilding their lives. And if sometimes, late at night, those women hear gentle whispers offering comfort and understanding, well, that's just part of the house's new purpose. The spirits of the past making sure that no more victims are forgotten, no more crimes go unanswered. Because that's the thing about secrets buried in walls. They don't stay buried forever. Eventually, they find a voice. Eventually, they find someone to make them heard. I still get letters from survivors who've stayed here. They all mention the same thing: how safe they feel in this old house, how they sometimes sense unseen presences watching over them. Guardian angels, some call them. But I know better. I know they're the whispers in the walls, still standing guard, still making sure their story is remembered, still making sure nothing like their fate ever happens in this house again. After all, some secrets deserve to be told, some voices deserve to be heard, and some spirits never rest until justice is done. The whispers taught me that.